Welcome to Deep Americana. Today on Deep Americana, I'll be interviewing Ken Boe about his art and reality. So, with that, Ken, would you elaborate a bit on your experimental art? I know you use some encaustics and some oils. Like what?
Well, hi there, Ray. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I appreciate being on your gig here. Yeah, I use this term experimental artist and or painter. Probably same for my poetry. It's my nature. To me, it's the era we live in. But with the painting, I guess it starts with my feeling that technique is what creates all style, ideas. This is what motivates me. So I'm always trying to, it's just what I want to do, develop different techniques and materials that I can use from one idea to the next, and just keep jamming those out, and both intellectually and improvisationally, left brain, right brain, all of it, and, just dancing along, drum soloing along, and so I do work with waxes, and I work with tree resins and oils. Those are all oleesters. I love that kind of alchemy.
Right.
I find experimental surfaces to paint those things on. It's quite often, it's somewhat formal, painting on a square or a rectangle, but canvas or panel quite a bit. Different plasters that I might put on there with different effects that I can then do the encaustic on, and then the oil. To a certain extent, I like to resist the term encaustic because it's become a commercial art supply term, and which has developed, I think, techniques and art supplies that define it.
Right.
And I'm interested in the term idiom, which in general usage might refer to figures of speech or even cliche, but in the arts, you kind of develop your own idiom, or a genre may have its idiom, or like pop art may be kind of an idiom, or a certain pop artist that has their own idiom.
Right. Kind of like pockets.
Defined by silkscreen or whatever. But
right.
So going back to what I'm doing, I'm always trying to break idioms. At the same time, you end up developing your own idiom, and the specific introduction of the next idea is pulling it forward. So I don't always sketch images. I do so in terms to kind of outline things. I'll often sketch by writing a list.
Right.
And so I'm putting forth these ideas, but then when I do it, that jam session's gonna happen as it happens, as I keep pulling in all my tools,
Right, that's kind of how a lot of my process will start too, is I'll get an idea, I'll jot it down, and then I will either start sketching some things, or I'll start just looking up different images of those types of ideas on, a Google search engine or something like that, and then, as you say, have a jam session with it,
And different, I probably have like 20 different series of works, because all these techniques that you find yourself inventing, or you discover some historical technique, and then you bring it back into your own hybrid of techniques and materials, and and ultimately these different styles or series that come out of them, and so there will be a little bifurcation, because you have a new discovery and it breaks off of what it came out of, and so each of these different series will really ultimately have its own set of parameters, so that one series is suddenly demanding me to do representational techniques that maybe I resisted, for a while, but learned in art school or whatever. But so then that, now I'm not going to maybe write a list the same way I did. I'm going to do formal sketches or something.
Right.
But then I'm going to rebel against that and bring something else into it, and on it goes. So, but I'd like to hybrid then back all those different techniques and series back into one master series. And that's when I'll know I've grown up.
Right.
And maybe at that point I'm not quite an experimental artist, but I've finally developed one master style after 40 years of all these different techniques and whatnot.
Well, let's say
that.
In that vein, if we go back and we look at someone like Jackson Pollock, right, that was highly experimental at that point, and now that is a master technique, So, yeah.
Right, but he went through a lot of different permutations
before
that.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of interesting art before that,
Yeah, didn't he had some pretty representational painting before that.
Well, you go back, far enough.
Yeah.
But I kind of like where he was between the total action painting and the representational painting. It was that kind of semi-abstraction where there were more forms that were ambiguous, but you could, at least subliminally latch onto, and that kind of thing. It could be a whole other conversation here,
Oh, yeah.
how we appreciate art unconsciously, which I think is a big utility to art. And probably why I do what I do.
Well, I think on that note, I think it is a huge utility to art, and I think that, we can actually cause change with art, especially with subliminal things as well, It's just like some of the stuff I work on as of late, my stuff was akin mainly to an illustration, and these last few types of pieces I've done, I've really broke it down to where it's almost childlike, some of it, right? In the application of the paint. So instead of having a detailed car, I'll have just that form, and then a detailed tire to the car, something of that nature.
Right. That's important. Because a representational image can take two directions in how you go about it initially. You can do a drawing of something in nature where you're just responding to light and dark. You're not trying to draw the thing itself.
Right.
You're not trying to draw the idea of the thing itself or paint the idea of the thing itself. That's a cartoon or a caricature.
Right.
Or a flat out symbol. Whereas a real tropical oil or realism or what have you, you're just responding to light and dark. And that's a wonderful meditation to engage in, but then not believing in dualities, and that's a whole other discussion we can have, or always wanting to challenge them at least. I think it's fun to have a little of both. Like almost in the way that light hits an object, so could the symbol hit the object and then just the light and dark of the object,
right?
One image, and I see you doing that a little bit. And this, of course, play brings up a lot of more important issues too, because we all play as children, and I don't think we ever stop doing that. It just becomes formalized in the habits of adult culture in other ways.
I do, and on that note, I honestly think that we need to bring back that curiosity, that childlike curiosity. I think that's very much what we're missing in our reality today. We are not curious, if like me, I am highly interested in other cultures, and learning about things. And I feel like in today's culture, we've lost that.
Yeah, it's weird, I mean, I realize this things can become kind of taboo in ways we don't always appreciate. We lose sight of it. When children play, but in adolescence, their hormones destroy a lot of neurons and different things are going on, and we're thrown into sexuality, and we forget a lot of what the intelligence and imagination that the cradle of our adult existence and intelligence and imagination, where it all began there. And yeah, it's worth thinking about and playing around with getting back to that.
Yeah, I think
at least for the sake of your own balance,
right,
as a person.
So let's shift gears a bit here, and I want to ask you. So how do we get people to be interested in each other? And I'll say one of the things I think on why people get so rooted in isms and assigning negative connotations to things they don't understand is because they don't ever leave where they're from. Most people in America never leave America, to go see another culture. And so I find it to be a financial type of thing and then an excuse. But that's to me that's almost the cure here in a way with a lot of what's going on today, is actually getting people to engage with each other and be curious enough about these cultures and actually understand what's really there.
Well, I agree, and I would like to use an analogy from the appreciation of art that I have. It's kind of a Humean concept, though it's kind of gone in my own directions, which is I don't believe that we really appreciate any kind of art that we haven't learned about.
Okay, that makes sense.
And how that works is there's formal learning, like reading from a book or going to a lecture, and then there's experiential learning, and that's more nebulous. We don't always know where we got it, or it's so far back we forget that we got it, and we just assume that we like what we like, and that's it.
Right.
It's just subjective. We like what we like, and but I believe there's actually more to it than that. That there's a decision there.
Well,
whether the decision was made for us or how we continue to make that decision.
Well, there is,
which is in a sense we're choosing not to like things because we're choosing not to learn about things.
Well, and I'll say I almost feel like it goes back to a Tool song where the lyrics are like sever the umbilical cord. A lot of people I don't think ever take the time to understand why they see things a certain way. And that goes from art to everything, right?
It's difficult. It's difficult for most people, who don't get on this train that we're on.
Right.
They're just told to have these common expectations of life and to not be concerned with things. I mean, most people, philosophy of art would be one of the least important things. But I think in the long run, it may turn out to be almost the only important thing.
Ken,
but that isn't the humanity where we're at yet.
Ken, if you ever looked into the idea that, like, during Greek times, art was a science and what that's about, I have not researched much into that. But
well, that's a whole big thing because Greece had different times in its own history. Ancient Greece had its own different times, and the Platonic philosophy, Plato basically thought that he was a statesman. Okay, he was the elite, and a lot of his writings are supposedly quoting Socrates, and that's another thing. But Plato essentially thought art was fake news, to put it in contemporary terms. Because it could only be fake news, because it could never be the truth, the real form of things. And then you go up to Aristotle, and then Aristotle starts actually getting into, well, whatever. These are actually some of the principles of our book of aesthetics, and we start getting into some other stuff. So those are huge. But okay, I just generalized in a way that would probably piss off some philosophers. I say Plato basically thought art was fake news.
Right.
That's just a way of communicating it to the contemporary age.
Right.
But the way that Plato wrote about that, there was a lot of intense stuff. And if I could make a point,
yeah,
all the philosophers of art, to me, are interesting and useful, because art is, just like obsolete sciences or obsolete technologies, at least in art, can be useful and interesting. And just like all art of any kind, whether or not you think it's bad or good, can be interesting, at least in a moment, somewhere in time where you experience it,
right,
in synchronicity or something. Right. And so, but we can't get too far into the ancient Greek, because that's a big subject.
Yeah.
But if we can remember what we were talking about, that got us there.
I think we were talking about people's perceptions.
And okay, we want to get back to talking about learning and loving and having empathy for each other, including right, those others that are foreign or alien to us.
Right.
And but appreciation, going back to that term, also is a bigger term than just I like or I don't like. Appreciation means maybe you have understanding, you have empathy, you can appreciate that. But it doesn't mean you like it, but you can appreciate it. It's it's another culture, you can appreciate it, but only to a limited extent, because you can never really be in that paradigm.
Right.
When I talk about paradigms, which are models of reality, the theory there is that you can never see outside of your paradigm. You can never really see into another paradigm, except that we can think by analogy, and that can kind of set up a way of us to understand or appreciate something. So, so you may study Hinduism or Buddhism or an obscure African tribe or, communism or capitalism or whatever ism, but, you can only put yourself there so far, and ultimately, since we're kind of greedy, we're going to want to see how we can bring it back as something that we can use in our experience, but that's okay. I think that's the best we can do, in appreciating others, is to relate it to analogically through analogies to, something in our own experience, and but hopefully expand our paradigms, our own model of reality, And of course, why am I an experimental artist and poet? I want to use that to do those things.
Right.
Like poetry, I can, just one poem, I can write 20 poems. It can be about 20 different little things in 20 different cultures where I just get into that thing, or maybe I scattershot around there a little bit. In a play or in fiction, those are places where you can really set up that analogy as a kind of temporary model of reality or paradigm. And then if you want to be Aristotelian, I can't say it, 3 acts. If you want to put it into 3 acts, you can go, a beginning, a middle act, and a third act, where you explore something in that other culture, in the fiction of the play, in the make-believe of the play, and really have more of an experience of the other as best we can,
Yeah. I think that's key. I think that's a big thing right now that's not happening. And that's why we have these breakdowns of communities, is that we don't have the empathy. We don't know.
Right. Well, it's not trendy, is it? Because
no,
we're very partisan. We're more partisan than ever.
Right.
And even though in our wisdom, what little wisdom we have, we know that has has to be a false duality. At least if we know there's things like what they call controlled opposition.
Right.
We know there have to be things in common, but we get so caught up on the partisan gravy train that we can't let ourselves free of it a lot of the time. And then on social media, get caught up in these either-or arguments. We don't want to give any ammunition to the enemy. I think that's one of the biggest problems in contemporary human rationality, is not wanting to give ammunition to the enemy. If I could make that into a kind of a trope.
Yeah.
Because what happens is, whether you're liberal or Democrat, you don't want to even address or give any semblance of credence, any agreement to what might be an object in the enemy, like dog whistle word that they're using.
Right.
And that can be real tricky, like whether it's free markets or it's socialism, they become these territories where either side is not allowed to give the other side any leeway, any territory, and so we miss out on the grand illusion, which is that in truth there's probably never been any capitalism that didn't have socialism. There's probably never been any socialism that didn't have capitalism, and those economic systems are not sciences.
Right.
And they're full of ideological barbed wire and dog whistle landmines, and it's all BS. And now I lean towards agreeing we could have really great social programs.
Right.
But I also think we need to have dynamic capitalist type things. But in a sense, I don't think any pure capitalism's ever existed. I don't think any pure free markets ever existed. I don't think any pure socialism's ever existed. And, it was common to say, at least in the Cold War, well, okay, the Soviet Union is communist, or some people say socialist.
Right.
But of course, it wasn't real communism. They never achieved it, but they were trying to. Well, then why not? I think the same is true for there was never any true capitalism. It was and that's painful for some people to say, because on either the left or right, because the capitalism could be a place that we could assign so much pain and suffering,
right,
from one point of view, and also so much glory and patriotism, or other folly from another point of view.
Right.
And it's all a bunch of nonsense and a false duality between the two that are just illusions.
Yeah, man.
What we really need is to craft, a real art and science of what can never be anything but both those things, and a lot more.
What it is, I firmly believe too, is it's narratives. It's narratives.
Yeah.
You can go back to MK Ultra. you can look at marketing, social media marketing. Look at all of this stuff. We very much understand how to direct traffic, and on traffic I mean minds, and how to divide people to basically be able to rule them. And I don't buy into that it's as much a giant conspiracy. I think that we very much should be able to use capitalism and socialism and infuse those together in such a way, which is what we have done for so long. A lot of people don't realize that your police department is socialist, your fire department is socialist, your military is socialist, food stamp socialist, Medicare, list could go on, right? And we function fine that way. And I think that we could have more programs there. And it's...
Yeah, and keep in mind also, all those government socialist operations also are public-private relationships. They outsource all kinds of stuff to big companies and hopefully more small local companies, and And I don't know that you could ever have it both ways. You know, even in the Soviet Union, they had to have all these small farmers. They tried to do collective farming, but in a sense, you could say that every human being that is a laborer is in his or herself a small business.
Right.
Whether even though they're just a worker or maybe belong to a union, they are in themselves an entrepreneur of their own survival, even if they're a fucking android robot.
Right. Right. So, what do you think about like the idea of like technocratic governments?
Well, I don't know everything. I think what do you got? You got technocracy. Like
Technocracy is what I mean. Yes.
Technocracy. They're all like ismsocracies.
Right.
I think that they were talking when all that austerity was going on in Greece, when the World Bank and all that had them under their thumb. They were talking about it being a technocracy. They got rid of all the politicians and brought in the technocrats.
Right.
Like the specialists from the university or from the banks or wherever, the think tanks, wherever you have those kind of specialists. But I, of course, like you probably too, I'm a little skeptical of specialist culture. I think that's one reason that we can't understand the other, to go back to what we were talking about,
right.
The bigger picture here, what we're talking about, is that there's this kind of idea put on us that you can only be a specialist, and it's a real big guilt trip in our culture that artists have to deal with, that a lot of people have to deal with, because really the exciting human being is more of a polymath, has several disciplines that they're kind of specialists in, and a lot of other things that they know a little bit about. And aside from the cliche that, a little bit of knowledge is dangerous, I think and for a democracy, we got to have that. But also that's where the intelligent person, but he's just a technocrat, can be a genius, is when they start letting some other stuff in. And then you can start to have that alchemy. You can start to have that hybrid creativity and knowledge, and you can start to have more analogies between different disciplines from which to understand things in a broader context or in different contexts. And likewise, you can understand the other better because you have experience with always putting different others together in your practical experience and in your creative experience. So we got to get beyond this. There's only enough time to be a specialist. And I realize it's tricky to think about, because you can take one discipline like biochemistry, and there's almost so much knowledge there that you can only be a specialist in a part of biochemistry. There's too much to know to be a specialist just in all biochemistry. But at the same time, maybe you need to also not just be a specialist in the genome or something, but you need to also know how to play a musical instrument or write poetry or a couple other things, and really be good at, but really be a master student of those things too, because otherwise, not only is it a failed democracy, it's gonna be a failed democracy. It's gonna be a failed world culture, because we don't know how to do anything but have a narrow focus.
Right.
That's not seeing the other.
Well, right. Which is what, and this brings me to a really good point, is the idea of collaboration. And I imagine you've collaborated a lot. I have too. And once you have that narrow view, you cannot collaborate. The collaboration is another thing I think that is lacking in today's culture.
Yeah, and I got something to say about that, which is territorialism.
Right.
And I see that provincialism like here in Bisbee, Arizona, where I live, which is a cool art town, and there's lots of awesome people here and things going on, and it's a crazy town. It's a great, and we got room for hundreds of more artists to move here, even though it's a small town with all these different landscapes. But at the same time, it gets its own provincialism because people start getting their own territory, and we've had an artist from LA come here through an artist residency. Her name's Muck Rock. She's a well-known LA street artist. And some of the local people, including artists, were attacking her work, bad-mouthing her online, really nasty, getting caught up in that kind of territorialism, I think. And there's a whole lot I could talk about there that we don't need to go into, but I'm against it.
Yeah.
I think that this territorialism gets down to the issue of collaboration, which is what he brought up.
Right.
Because of this kind of provincialism that can take over any town, but it's not just because we're a smaller community here. I think you'll find it in the larger art world, where, for instance, so-called difficult artists, artists that have a difficult personality or something, get weeded out of the gallery system because the art dealers don't want to deal with them.
At some rates,
that's a kind of provincialism or cancel culture.
Right.
Can be a kind of provincialism, as well as the reason we have cancel culture, which was racism and ethnocentricity.
Right.
Those are provincialisms also. And in the big picture, anthropomorphism is a kind of provincialism, where we're just a bunch of local yokels and we're getting caught up in our territory.
Right.
And to bring this point home in my own life, after this podcast recording, I've got to go meet my art assistant at the lumber yard. Her name's Candace Schroeder.
Okay.
Now, she's my art assistant. And now, in the history of art, we have art assistants.
Right.
And then we have the artist. And there's a lot of controversy in contemporary art because, Damien Hirst or whoever may have dozens of art assistants doing most of the work, including, work that the artist can do. But it all goes under the artist name, trademark, what you call it. And there's a territorialism to that.
Can I make a point on top of your point here?
Well, just to conclude, I'm declaring my art assistant a collaborator.
Awesome.
So we're collaborating also, but go on.
So when you talk about art assistants, that's happened through probably, there's probably someone handing a caveman, some pigment to blow on his hand on a cave wall, which was his art assistant, right? And so my point is that every movie you watch, tons of art assistants in there, right? Any publication we pick up, assistants in there. There should not be, to me, anything wrong within that as long as that relationship is empowering to that assistant, right? And I've had, and especially in school, there was a lot of conversation about, well, he doesn't make his own art, like Ed Paschke, if you know who he is. He has a lot of art assistants too. And people would be like, he didn't make that, someone else made it. It's like, no, but he directed. It's kind of like the writer to the artist in a comic book, if that makes sense.
We're using analogies from other genres of art where it makes perfect sense.
Right, where it's accepted.
Like a band that might have, like in big bands, they had a big band director. So the Lawrence Welk big band, before the TV show that people could still see.
Right.
He was a big band director, had his name on it, but there was total collaboration going on there.
Right.
And in a dynamic sense, too, because they were influenced, even though they were segregated often, they were influenced by that kind of, African American jazz that invented the kind of improvisation that we really value the most in jazz.
And that's a wrap for me and Ken. Please join us for the second part of this episode. And thank you for listening.